Okay, this one is a late entry here from MSI, but it's a very good one. It's the highest priced ITX board. Well, I guess it's the highest priced ITX board that I have seen. And we're going to see if this is the best X870 ITX board on the market now. Welcome to Machines and More. Here on this channel, I cover a variety of PC building and related topics. Today we're doing an ITX board review, and I have reviewed the other two X870i boards that are on the market. That is the ASUS ROG Strix and the Gigabyte Aorus Pro. And when I wrap this review, I will also share my thoughts on whether this new MSI X870i is worthy of being the best on the market now. But I'll just lead by focusing on the board itself first. Before we begin, I do need to let you know that the test board was provided by MSI for the purposes of my making this review. Big thank you to them, but I am not paid by them for this review, and they will not see my feedback until you do. And I always aim to provide objective and independent feedback for my review. So if you enjoy this type of content, please go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, and please also give a like because it really helps at this stage. The full name of this motherboard is the MSI MPG X870I Edge TI Evo Wi-Fi, which is very much a mouthful. Main takeaways from that name. This board features the higher-end X870i chipset, which will run the latest AM5 AMD socket CPUs. In the ITX world, there are not any X870E boards, so this is as high as it gets. And also MSI places this in their MPG Edge lineup, which is their high-performance gaming-focused product lineup. It's not the top tier though. There hasn't been that even higher MEG spec in an ITX board for a few generations now. The last one was the MEG Z690i, which I have. And I think many of you would love to see another board like that spec, but this board has excellent features as well. And that TI refers to the color of the board. It's this gray silver titanium finish, and that can work with a variety of different colored cases. At the same time, it's not perfect for some of them as well. A review of the board features here, so AM5 CPUs. If you are looking at running a Ryzen 7000, Ryzen 9000 CPU, or Ryzen 8000 APU, this is going to do it. Power delivery for that CPU will come courtesy of 8 110 amp V-core stages, and there's also another 2+1 stage setup for the SoC and miscellaneous power. The IO side heatsink is beefy and very shiny. I test fit it with a Thermalright AXP90X47, and that this board heatsink will not interfere with a cooler like that, so you shouldn't have problems with these really super low profile coolers. You'll notice a notched out section for a VR cooling fan, and I noticed that the tuning for this fan out of the box is very reasonable. It's definitely tuned a bit more reasonably versus a board such as their B850i. And the X870i's stock curve has the fan at only 7,500 RPM when it hits 100 degrees on the CPU. So for reference, the B850i's had its board cooling fan pegged at 9,000 RPM at 70 degrees. So if you don't do anything to the fan curve, I think this one is already going to be less noticeable. You may still want to tweak it, though, at a minimum to index to the most temp, though. That seems to be more reasonable to, pair with that. M.2 heatsink, quite tall. It's not very wide, but just be aware of this fact. It is taller than the IO side heatsink by a little bit. And this is an independent unit that cools the Seoul Gen 5 M.2, which runs off of the CPU lanes. And this may be the best heatsink on any ITX board that I've tried out in terms of how easy it is to remove, because you just depress the button on the right and boom, you're ready right away. Underneath the heatsink is where the RGB and front panel connectors are. They're not as readily accessible, so probably something I would plug in at the same time when that M.2 heatsink is off. At the back, there's a second M.2 slot, which is Gen 4 compatible, and that runs off the chipset lanes. And you will have to provide your own cooling solution if you want it. And then if you choose to use this guy here, this is the 5-in-1 expander riser card, which slots into the right of the RAM slots. This guy has a capacity for a third M.2 slot, and this is also a Gen 4 that's going to run off the chipset lanes. So about this expansion card, or what they call the FP card, this is probably the Achilles heel for this board. If you follow along my motherboard reviews, you'll know that in general, I'm not a big fan of this type of arrangement Now, while the front panel connectors are on the main board itself, which is great, this expansion card houses a few headers that more likely than not will make this mandatory. So if your case has a front USB-A port, you'll need this. If you have a front USB Type-C port, you will need this. If you want that aforementioned third M.2, which, totally optional, to a lesser extent, the two SATA ports on here, and even lesser, the JFP2 system speaker header. But that means that unless you are running a case like, say, the T1V2 or something without any front USB, you're going to want this. And it is very big compared to the ASUS FPS2 card, which is equipped with their X870I board. But this one is in a potentially very crowded area cabling wise, because in fact, with my test setup with the Noctua D15G2, you will not be able to plug in the Type-C header because the fan overhangs the card and it does not give enough space here to plug it in because it comes in from the top and the fan covers it. Connecting to a Type-A header will also be difficult because next to that Type-C front panel header is a male Type-C connector. MSI supplies this so-called expander cable, which is basically a dongle that will then connect to your Type-A cable from your case. And I just think that some folks are really gonna dislike this arrangement because that's a lot of stuff here, right? And you got cables, and then, like I said, fan overlapping here. It's not gonna work. So one thing, I do realize that many users will not be using a big tower cooler like the D15G2 in their ITX build, right? Just like I used for my testing. So outside of that scenario, if you have clearance, there may be actual slight silver lining to have this because it can be a little bit easier to plug your front panel USB cables into this, plug everything you need, and then just pop this riser card into the board. So there's that. So it can vary, but I, in general, not a big fan of these things. Board is equipped with 2 DDR5 slots, up to 64 gigs per slot, and one of the highest frequency specs here in a 10,000 megatransfers per second spec, and that is, of course, an OC. Realistically, the board spec is rarely going to be your limiting factor over what your CPU is capable of, but at least on paper, this is a top-tier spec here. To the top right of the DDR5 slots is a debug LED, which is a very important feature if you want to know what your system is doing when you boot it up. At the very top of the board, you have 3 fan headers. This placement here is excellent. It's very easy to find. MSI did a good job with that. It has the front panel audio, which is spec'd with an ALC 4080, and that's a very solid codec for a higher end ITX board. If we turn our attention to the back of the board, there's really not too much to speak to. As mentioned, this is an Edge MPG level board. That typically does not feature too much in the way of backboard heatsinks, so we just really have the back M.2 here. So the rear I/O is the area where this board really truly shines. Top left is onboard HDMI. You get 5 10G Type-A ports and 2 USB-C 40G. Either of these 40G ports are DisplayPort compatible as well. On top of this, there is a third Type-C port which runs at 10G. In terms of the USB ports, when you consider the high-speed capability, this is going to be top tier for mini-itx. Furthermore, the board features a killer networking spec. So just like the B850i and B860i from MSI, we have a 5G eNIC and Wi-Fi 7. One thing I always like to mention with their latest generation, because I think MSI did such a great job with this, is their Wi-Fi antenna. It is a quick release one with the included antenna, but you can still use a regular threaded Wi-Fi antenna connection if you have one that you prefer and you want to use theirs, right? And that's not something that all board manufacturers do. At the very bottom, optical audio, there's a mic in and a line out port. On this board, there's also a flash BIOS button along with a clear CMOS button. Now, the placement, I'm a little bit hesitant about that. It's not super proud, but the more central placement means that if you do reach over the case to plug something into the back of the board, say, for example, to those middle 2 10G ports, there's somewhat of a possibility you will accidentally press the clear CMOS, right? And I personally would have preferred this close to the top like the B850i has, or at a minimum away from the proximity of the ports where you might access regularly. It's not ideal, but I think overall these are still 2 good features to have. And I actually used the flash BIOS functionality to update the BIOS without any issues, even though it did take a lot longer than I expected to complete the process. Overall, rear I/O is as strong as it gets in mini-itx. The ASUS X870I does trade off one 10G8 port for three 2.0 Type A ports. And considering that most of us will have a keyboard and mouse, that setup may be slightly preferable, since in that scenario, you can still preserve four 10G ports, and plus you still have one 2.0A port versus the three 10G ports that you would just be left with on the MSI. But you do have the onboard audio, 5GE on the MSI, which I think more than makes up for that. So to test this board, I ran with a bunch of AM5 CPUs. I ran both single and dual CCD CPUs, 9950X, 9800X3D. I did my testing with 9850X3D on this one and did not have any issues during my testing. Compared against the Gigabyte Aorus Pro and ASUS ROG Strix, the clocks with the Ryzen 7 9800X3D were quite good. And I noticed that the bone stock package power draw with the MSI was the lowest without sacrificing performance. In fact, if you lifted the boost clock ceiling to remove the bottleneck, the CPU will just boost up to a similar package power level as the other two boards, but at a higher clock speed. As mentioned, the fan curve for the mini board cooling fan is a little bit more tame compared to most ITX boards that I've seen. In practice, if you leave the fan curve as is with an AM5 CPU at full load, hitting that typical 70 to 80 degree range, the fan will spin up to somewhere around the 2000 to 2500 RPM range. Already, it's not particularly audible at that level. I think most would have difficulty picking it out over the CPU fans at that point. Here you see the most and chipset temps are great, and if you wanted to lower the fan RPM by more precisely indexing it to the most temp instead, it will run at an even lower level, like around 1800 RPM, and that should not have a negative impact on things. So yes, got the strongest out of the box performance. I also used it in my clock scaling experiment with the 9800X3D, and the manual overclocking works extremely well on this board. On paper, the ASUS ROG Strix board has a higher spec power delivery setup with 110 amp stages versus the 810 amp stages on the MSI, but there's more than enough here for the vast majority of users, even those that are pushing a heavier overclock. Okay, so back to the original question, is this the best X870 ITX board right now? Well, in terms of the performance, it is top-notch. I/O, it's comparable to the ASUS Strix. Perhaps it's better if networking is more what you need. And it also has onboard audio. In terms of the drive potential, you got three M.2s here, and that's a win. Although, you know, the third M.2 requires this thing. And like I said, probably the biggest pain point with this board. But other than this, the layout, touch points are actually top-notch. The board cooling fan behavior and BIOS are excellent. The one area where I think this does lose to the ASUS is the build quality, because the ASUS at a minimum has a protective back shield, and this doesn't really have anything. Nonetheless, as a whole, I think there is a very strong argument for this being the best X870i board right now. However, it's also priced well and above all the others. It's a whopping $450 US at the launch, and that is significantly more than the $390 that the ROG Strix board has been coming in at lately. And at a time where build components are already elevated in price, you know, DDR5 kit, this does sting a little bit, right? Because this is a big investment on top of a big investment, and I hope that this board price can come down a little bit, which will, you know, make this more compelling for a broader audience. So what is that audience? So I really think you need to ask yourself, do I really need this? Do I really need the features? The vast majority of folks that are building general purpose or gaming AM5 ITX systems really, I think, should go for a B850 chipset board. You're going to get similar performance at a much lower price point, the downside being slightly weaker I/O features, and MSI makes a killer B850i board that I highly recommend. I would consider this board only for high-end builds, and even then perhaps specifically high-end production ITX systems where you absolutely need the extra I/O features, such as those plentiful high-speed 40 gig ports or that third M.2, again caveating that, you know, you need this, and tower coolers don't work well with this potentially if you have that second fan over it. Or if you're thinking to do some heavy manual CPU overclocking as well, I think this board is really good for that. But yeah, it's a great board if it fits the budget, and definitely consider it for your next high-end build. And hey, let me know what you think about the board in the comments down below. I will also leave links for you to check out. Please check those out and support the channel. As always, big thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.